I'm Louisa Scioscia Stephens, and here it is, Friday, February 13th, 2004. I'm in Grand Central Station, New York City. I'm 56. I'm interviewing my mother.
I'm Mary Scioscia. I'm 77. My daughter told me about this place to tell my life story, and I find it quite interesting.
And I was going to ask this time if you could just tell me some things that you remember about your own mother and your father. Going back to when you were a child, think about how they were like, what kind of people they were.
My mother, Louisa Isabel Hershey, but she'd been born Louisa Isabel Smith, was a very lively person, loved to entertain, loved to read. And my father, John Harold Hershey, was a doctor, and I thought he was absolutely perfect. And
was your mother a good cook?
No.
No, not a good cook. Was your father a good cook? Oh.
Well, he made fudge. But otherwise, I don't ever remember him cooking. But we actually always had a maid who cooked. And if a mother did do the cooking, it was something very healthful always, because she was a dietitian, and we always had lots of salad and lots of vegetables, and we ate very healthfully.
And you said they liked to entertain. Were you invited to the parties?
Well, I could sit on the stair steps and listen to them sing and play the piano. My father was a very good singer, and he just loved to sing, and there'd be about 8 or 10 people gathered around the piano. Mother didn't like to sing, but she loved the gathering.
So their parties were musical parties?
Well, that was one kind of their parties. They entertained a lot, and they had many friends, and they went out a lot to friends' houses.
And how about your mother's mother and father? What do you know about them, or what can you remember about them?
Well, my mother's father I never met because he died long before I was born. I knew my mother's mother, my Grandma Bruff. She was Grandma Smith, but then she later married someone named Bruff after her husband died. I knew her very well, saw a lot of her. We, all my family on both sides is from Canada, and of course, as you know, I was born in Canada too. And we went there almost every summer, so I saw all of the relatives on both sides of the family. But Grandma, my mother's mother, also lived with us part of the time. And she was just a very lively person. She made friends everywhere. I think I told you about how she was buying a fishbowl at the dime store and made friends with a lady who was also buying a fishbowl.
A fellow customer.
A fellow customer, and they went to England together on a trip. They just made friends in 3 minutes. And that's the way my grandma was. She was just a very friendly person. And what was the other thing you asked me?
Well, actually, I don't remember, but I wanted to ask you about. So she was who was she married to? Who was she first married to?
Smith, Reverend Smith, and she met him at a party to which he had not been invited, and the
Reverend crashed.
No, he didn't crash. Another friend called and said, could he bring his friend, and that's how my grandma met him, and she was just love at first sight, and they had a very, very happy marriage and 4 wonderful children, but he died young. And 2 or 3 years later, she married a man she'd known all her life. He'd gone to the same private schools that she had, and she lived with him about 3 months and found that she just couldn't stand him.
The marriage didn't last. Huh?
No, but they never got divorced, and I met him. She took me to his, he was very, very wealthy, but he had a farm just for fun. That was his hobby. And Grandma, took me to that farm and met him. And he just knocked himself out to be nice to me and show me every animal and tell me all the details. And he obviously was still crazy about my grandmother. And I can't right now think of what his name was. But she'd known him.
Bruff.
Hugh Bruff, that's right, because she was Grandma Bruff. Yeah,
right.
That's right.
And any insight onto why that marriage was so short-lived?
Well, I just think he was very self-centered, is what I gathered. He was so wonderful to me that day, but I think he might have bossed Grandma around, and Grandma was the one who wanted to boss people around.
Yeah, it's always difficult problem.
But he absolutely, it was obvious to me that he just adored my grandmother and probably had for, long before he married her.
And you said that they'd grown up together, or
They'd gone to, they couldn't have gone to school together. They had known each other all their lives. But she went to a girls' school, and she went to school in England, come to think of it. Because my grandma's my grandmother's father sent them to England because he didn't think there were any good schools in the United States or Canada.
just one continent to couldn't educate their young. So she went to England.
She and her brothers went to England, and her father demanded that they know how to speak perfect French, perfect German, perfect Italian, and of course, naturally, perfect English.
And did they?
Yeah, I guess they did. Because when her French wasn't good enough, he made her take more classes.
And they stayed in France for a while, right? The kids did?
Yeah, they spent a year in France.
So was that standard education?
I would think that was for wealthy people. I don't think that was usual.
So then
and I think they had good schools in Canada, too.
Right.
And the United States. But, of course, all my relatives were Canadian.
Now, her father, the one that made her become so well-educated and go to England,
yeah,
he was from England himself, right?
Yes, and the only reason that he lived in Canada was that he had a big business of selling china. So he would come from England and go to Canada and then go back home to England. And he met this lovely woman who was the daughter of a man who had a boys' school, but he'd educated his daughter privately. So she was very well educated, but in those days, girls weren't much educated.
But she was an exception, you mean?
Yeah, and he met her, and she was 16, and he was 30, I think. And he fell in love with her and wanted to marry her, and she was quite happy to marry him, but she would not move to England, and that's why he moved to Canada, just so he'd be with her. And I never got to meet him, but I had a long, happy relationship with her because she lived into her 90s. So I saw her every summer when we went to Canada, and we wrote to each other every week. And I think I've shown you her letters.
Yes.
We were very good friends. She was a very lively, spirited person.
And I think she lived until you were 14.
Well, she lived into her 90s. I don't remember
right.
how old I was, but she
Right.
was in her 90s.
So her father was Stapleton Caldecott.
Yeah.
And his first cousin was Randolph Caldecott, right?
Right.
And they were good friends, and they'd grown up together in Chester, England.
I think they lived right next door to each other. And he was going to come see my great-grandmother and great-grandfather, but he and he'd never left England. He came over here to the United States one time because he was invited, because he was an artist, and he was invited to give a talk down in Florida or somewhere down there in that general area. And he said, well, as soon as he gave his talk, he'd go up to Canada to see his cousin and all the family, and he dropped dead there in
as a very young man, right?
Yeah, he was young.
Right.
So he
Randolph
didn't,
Caldecott
so
had a
he
short...
didn't get to go visit them in
Right.
Canada. But when my husband and I went to England, we went all through where that family had lived and saw a lot.
In Chester, England.
Yeah, in Chester.
So that was...
So now my mind's blank.
Oh, so that was Stapleton Caldecott, and that was your grandmother's father.
Mm-hmm.
And her mother was Emma Mary Arnold, right?
Oh. And she, as I said, grown up as the daughter of this man who had a boys' school.
That was Hezekiah Arnold.
Oh, and so when they first met and married, they lived in, what's that eastern town? City?
Montreal.
Montreal. They lived in Montreal. And she never intended to leave Montreal.
That was your grandmother, and your grandmother Isabel Caldecott, who married...
Annie Mary, wasn't... Oh, no, that was on my other side.
Isabel Caldecott. And she was born Isabel Arnold.
And
then she married Stapleton Caldecott.
Right.
And they lived in Montreal.
They did, until... I can't remember what the reason was, but my her husband wanted to move to Toronto, Canada, Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And I can't remember what the reason was, and he said, well, he just wanted to do it for a couple of years. It had something to do with his selling. Well, as it turned out, they lived there for the rest of her life, which was she was well into her 90s. And of course, she grew to love Toronto, but she had really been angry about leaving the other, where she'd grown up.
Montreal?
Yeah, Montreal.
So she was there. That's where your mother, Louisa, was born. And that's where you were born, right, in Toronto?
In Toronto.
So she stayed there for quite a while.
Well, yeah, because she was probably fairly young when they moved there, and she lived into her 90s, as I say, so she did live there a long time. And they had a huge, huge house. It took up a whole block. She didn't live in it when I visited her. She was in a much smaller place, but she and her husband and the kids had a big, giant house. And I think she lived very comfortably and happily.
So this is Isabel, your grandmother.
Uh-huh.
Right. And then her mother and father, they were married in Isle of Wight, right? And they emigrated. And didn't Hezekiah Arnold set up a boys' school or in Montreal?
Yeah, that's the school I was talking about.
I heard this rumor, I can't remember where, so it could be true or not true, that Tom Brown's school days, was that headmaster was based on your father, who I guess was sort of must have been a character.
Not my father.
Oh no, that's right. Your grandmother's father.
Yeah.
Hezekiah Arnold.
Well,
might be true, might be not true.
No, it probably is, but I don't remember it.
So,
because as you know, my memory is slipping.
Everyone's is. So, they married. They were married in Isle of Wight, and they moved to Montreal, and they raised their family. So we sort of know.
And then they moved to Toronto.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, how about sort of coming all the way back down to your parents? Now, your father. Where did your father grow up?
He grew up in a town north of Toronto.
Owen Sound?
Owen Sound, yeah. And his father was a doctor, and he had, a brother and two brothers and a sister. And one of his brothers turned out to be a doctor, and of course Dad did too. And he wanted me to be a doctor, but I didn't want to. And when he was in college or in medical school, at the same school I think that his dad had gone to, the same medical school in Toronto, his father died, and so his mother and sister and brothers moved down to live with their aunt in Toronto, right across the street or very close to the medical school.
And actually, didn't his mother die right after that? So that he really was left within a month
You're
or two
right.
of...
Yeah, so it was the kids.
The four children. And it wasn't his younger brother in medical school with him?
I don't know whether he was in it at the same time, but he did go to the same medical school.
I think what happened is your father went and served in World War I.
Yeah.
And so he was delayed. Then he came back to medical school, and by that time, his younger brother was old enough to join him.
Yeah, it might have overlapped. I'd forgotten that.
And so
that younger brother eventually worked in the United States. And, well, so did my dad. What were you going to say?
So then the two boys were medical school, and their younger brother and sister
were teachers, school teachers.
Eventually became school teachers, but at that time were
eventually they were.
Right. And so then they all lived with their aunt, who is your great Aunt Dora, right?
Uh-huh. Right. So there was great Aunt Dora and Aunt Dora in the same house by then,
because your brother had your father had a sister who was Dora and an aunt who was Dora.
Right.
And that
so
aunt
that's
was
why
Dora.
I always called the older one great aunt. Whenever I was talking about her, otherwise people wouldn't know which Aunt Dora I meant.
Right. And also it was the right word for her because she was your grandfather's sister, or your grandmother's sister rather. And she has an interesting story, right?
Well, she was a doctor, and she worked at the same hospital, the same medical school that she and my dad and their grandfather had gone to. So she could just walk across from her house to the medical school and take care of her patients. But she also had an office in her house, and every year when I visited them, I'd see her office, and often see her patients go upstairs, and then her sister,
Anna Mary Johnson.
Yeah, she always lived with Great Aunt Dora.
Oh, no,
And
Anna Mary Johnson was your grandmother, but her sister Beth always lived with her?
Aunt Beth, yeah. Aunt Beth lived with her and took care of the house, cooked the meals and cleaned the house and everything.
And doesn't Aunt Dora have a great story about how she became a doctor in the first place? Because it was the middle of the 19th century. It wasn't...
Well, she was one of the
very
first
yeah.
women doctors there were. And my dad was so proud of her for that. And when she graduated from medical school, when she went into medical school, half the men doctors were nasty as could be to her because they thought she was really disgusting to come into medicine. And then another half of the men were nice to her, and one of them was my grandfather. That's how they got to be good friends. She came down here and worked in the United States, right here in New York, at that hospital that's over on the river, because they took women doctors, but there wasn't anywhere in Canada she could work as a doctor. They were going to offer her jobs that were not even as high as nurses' jobs. It was just ridiculous. It was such prejudice.
Wasn't she instrumental in opening the women's hospital?
I don't know if she was instrumental, but that's why she went back to Canada.
And weren't you interviewed by someone who was doing research on the women's hospital?
Well, you know, my memory's falling apart. If you remember
I
that,
think that's
probably
true. I think it's true. And I always love the story of how she became a doctor in the first place.
How did she?
She was a teacher.
Oh yeah, she was a teacher. She was a teacher, and she married the principal, and they had a little boy, and her husband and her little boy died in a flu epidemic, and so she didn't want to go back to teaching, and that's when she decided to go to medical school. So that's why she was quite a bit older than my grandfather when they were in medical school together. She was maybe 7 or 8 years older than him.
But they became friends anyway.
They were friends forever, and she'd have a gathering of people over, and that's how he met her younger sister, whom he married,
right,
and who became my
that was Annie Mary Johnson.
Yeah.
Her older sister was Dora Johnson before she married, and then Dora got to be good friends with John Hershey, your grandfather. And through that friendship, he met Dora's younger sister, Anna Mary. And Annie Mary.
Right.
Yeah, so it's a great story. So then his father had been a farmer, I think you said. And I think you said that then
his father had been a doctor. Dad's father.
The
generation before that.
The generation
they
before
probably
that.
were farmers.
Yeah, and I think you'd said that your grandfather's brothers were farmers.
Probably, yeah.
So it was farming stock, but then your grandfather became a doctor, and your father and his brother became a doctor, and you didn't, even though your father wanted you to, but your son did.
Right.
Right. So that was interesting. Where did that family come from? That's the John Hershey family.
I thought they came from Scotland. You say you don't think I'm right.
Well, I thought they came from Switzerland and Germany.
Okay, I
thought they
you're
came
more
in.
likely to be right than me, because as I say,
I think they came from in a Mennonite immigration to Pennsylvania.
Oh, you're right.
The Hersheys, and then
they didn't believe in war.
Right, exactly. So that
in fact, it was what was the war before the Civil War?
Well, maybe the Revolutionary War or.
Well, it was one of those wars. My dad's branch left the United States. There's still a lot of Hersheys in
Pennsylvania.
In Pennsylvania, but my dad's branch went to Canada because they just would not have anything to do with a war. Although, a couple of generations later, my dad was in World War I.
Right.
Fought in World War I.
So that's where the John Hershey's came from. And then Anna Mary Johnson, that family, the one that had Dora.
Well, I think she must have been the Scottish one.
I think you're right.
Because I knew somebody in Dad's family was Scottish. Yeah, they came from Scotland.
Right. And other stories I've always liked. I like the stories of the great aunts taking you and your sister around. And I realized by getting all this generation straight that those 3 great aunts, Aunt Dora, Aunt Beth, and another great aunt, they were the same generation as your grandparents. And in fact, they were your grandmother's sisters. But because you didn't have grandparents, they really filled that place, the grandparent place, these 3 aunts.
Well, on Dad's family, I didn't have grandparents. I had a grandmother on mother's side.
Yes, right, of course.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was very close to all of them, and of course they acted like my sister and I were just marvelous, perfect
probably true.
children. Yeah, I'm sure it was true.
And then also you had a very close relationship with your great grandmother, my great great grandmother.
On my mother's side.
On your mother's side.
Very close. And she's the one who had refused, said she didn't want to ever leave. What was this place?
Montreal.
Montreal. But, she eventually was happy in
Toronto.
And we wrote each other, we corresponded every week. That was Mother's who got us started doing that. And then, of course, I saw her every summer, and I was very, very fond of her. And she seemed to be very fond of me.
What was she like?
She was just real peppy and full of ideas and loved to read. And her letters are just intriguing, and she was fun to visit, and she was just a lively, bright-eyed lady. Right on to, I never thought of her as old.
So she was a lively person. So you have some interesting relatives, Mother.
Uh-huh.
Which means I have some interesting relatives now that I think about it. Well, are there any sort of last little things you'd like to tell me about your mother and father, from memories from when you were small? Like, let's say Halloween parties or...
Well, oh yeah, the Halloween party when Mother, because I grew up in the Depression, and Mother would not let me have a party which kids would be expected to bring a gift to, because they knew that everybody was poor. And and my birthday was just 3 or 4 days after Halloween, so I had to have a Halloween party every year. And the one that I remember best was the year that my dad, who was a short, stubby man, dressed in a dress. And all the kids from my class were just enchanted by this. They just gathered around him, and they really just adored him.
And he was really the town doctor as well.
Yeah, he was.
So he sort of shed that dignity.
Yeah. He had a great sense of humor. And Mother was all dressed up as a beautiful Spanish lady with all kinds of lovely clothes, and I thought that was elegant, but she didn't make the hit that Dad did. And we had the party there outdoors, and we lived at a house that had a big hill, and you could run. The kids had a marvelous time running all over, and everybody loved being in costumes. I think we're just about time's up, isn't it?
Well, time's not ever up in a way, but for yeah. Well, what do you remember about your sister?
Well, my little sister that I thought I picked out at the hospital, because Mother told me to pick her out.
Said pick out your
yeah.
sibling. Did she specify it should be a girl, or were you allowed to?
Well,
pick
you
out
can't
any
really
baby?
tell when you look at the babies.
Oh, I see. You were just.
Anyway, I believed my mother. I believed her that she brought home the one I picked out. And of course, I adored my little sister. And she was, I think, wasn't she 4 years younger than me? Yeah. And we were always very close friends. And of course, she felt that I was very old and very, very intelligent and
capable in every
practically
way.
Like an adult. And I accepted that.
Why not?
But as you know, my sister committed suicide.
I know.
So there's a sad ending to her story, and I really never had gotten over that.
Yeah.
She called me a few days before she died and asked if there was anything I needed. Did I need any bills to be paid? And I thought, what's she doing asking me all this private stuff? And then, 2 or 3 days later, she was dead, and I realized she had wanted to be sure that if I needed help, she was going to leave money for me. And I guess I was so snappish and so independent, she didn't leave me anything. But she did it to my kids, whichever kid she thought needed it. Because she was really a very good person.
Right. Well, that was a sad ending to an otherwise quite lively and happy life, right?
Yeah.
Or for
and I never have understood why, except she had a mental illness. I know that. Maybe she thought it was just going to get worse.
Yeah.
This is too bad to end the story.
Well,
on
let's
this.
not. Let's instead think about something that you guys did together. Was she in on that story where you went to get the ice cream, and the hat ribbons matched the ice cream?
No, she hadn't been born yet. And I got pink ice cream to match the pink ribbon on my hat, and Mother took the little girl next door who had I think green ribbon, and is there green ice cream, whatever.
Yeah, sure.
I can't remember anymore. And then Mother also matched the ribbon on her hat. In those days, women did not go out without hats.
They didn't go to the
that
ice
would
cream
be
parlor without hats.
very unladylike
I
to
see.
go out without a hat. That was a long time ago.
Well, Mother, thank you very much for telling me all these stories.